November 30th, 1941, a week before the day that would live in infamy. Doesn't quite have the same ring, does it? November 30th, 1941 was, by all accounts, a day like any other day. It was a Sunday. Over the American Protectorate of Hawaii, the sun was shining. At the U.S. Army Air Station at Hickam Field, P-40 fighter planes were parked on the flight line, wingtip to wingtip, to prevent enemy sabotage. Just a short distance away, the naval base and new home of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Pearl Harbor, was just starting its day. Worship services were available to those aboard ship who hadn't had too much fun the night before. Maintenance crews began their practice of swabbing the decks, tending to the engines, and retouching the paint on the battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that sat at anchor. There was a slight feeling of tension in the air, but there was no alarm. It was well known the Japanese march through Asia, its seizing of Manchuria, and the invasion of China. In fact, the Japanese aggression was why the U.S. had moved its battle wagons and aircraft from San Diego to Pearl Harbor in the first place. Even despite the move, no one at the base felt any threat. The firepower America could bring to bear would simply deter any aggressor. November 30th, 1941. 6 aircraft carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy were halfway to their objective. Inside these vessels, which would, in 7 days, change the course of history, the men were busy maintaining aircraft, checking ordnance, and going over the battle plans in their heads. They also wrote home to their families, attended their own worship services, and went over the day-to-day operations aboard their ships. That's pretty much where the similarity ends. The mood of the Japanese sailors was different than those on Pearl Harbor. Many were apprehensive. Some could even say were nervous. In 7 days, if they received their command, many of these young men would race to their planes and take to the sky, all for the glory of their emperor. Theirs was a mission of divine necessity, for in order for the Japanese Empire to survive, other empires must be pushed aside. These men had been raised and trained under the code of Bushido, where honor was everything. Soon they would be called upon to show just what they had learned. So much for the history lesson. When I was asked to do the sermon on the anniversary of Pearl Harbor, I was excited. The day when America was drawn into World War II, that's kind of my forte. I'm a history buff, and I'm certified to teach subjects like this. So this would be right in my wheelhouse. Then I was given 2 guidelines. First, my sermon was not to be a straight history lesson. Oops. Second, I was to figure out a way to tie this event to our Unitarian Universalist faith. How to tie a 73-year-old event into a faith that had not yet seen its merger. Okay. Then as if I needed another challenge. It turned out that the date of my service, December 7th, the actual anniversary, was to be pushed back a week because we have a guest minister coming in. So now, here I am on the 30th, and hence my opening. So now my sermon will center not on the actual attack, but on the perspectives of the 2 sides, as well as an attempt to show a current example of how perspectives, used unwisely, can sometimes cloud a free and independent search for truth and meaning, which is one of our central principles. I will also show how my personal perspectives on this current issue shape my own search. Pearl Harbor, after all, didn't just randomly happen on December 7th, but it was planned months in advance. The Americans, for all their surprise, were not caught flat-footed either. They saw, with every passing day, Japan's desire to expand. The U.S. was also aware of the atrocities that Japan committed during the expansion. As many in the U.S. still felt that this nation should stay neutral, men in power were building a steady distrust of anything Japanese. Japan's government was no doubt doing the same against American citizens. Soon, propaganda experts on both sides were making their citizens feel it too. Pearl Harbor would be the spark that would set off the American response for retribution. It was a policy that would result in internment of Japanese Americans here at home, the knee side, total war in the Pacific, and it would usher in the advent and use of the most terrifying weapon ever created. America's war in the Pacific differed from its conflict in the European theater in that Americans had a tangible day to start hating the Japanese. Our distrust of those sneaky, yellow, slant-eyed demons took hold shortly after the news of the attack reached the mainland. The cleanup had not even started in Hawaii, and Americans were looking at Japanese Americans differently. Japanese Americans were no doubt on a heightened sense of anxiety, afraid that their native land had tarnished them in the eyes of their adopted land. These feelings created an environment that was at best tense, and at worst, violent. There was certainly no respect for the inherent worth and dignity of each person, nor was there any compassion or justice in the Japanese aggression or in the American response. I am reminded of the words of Admiral William Bull Halsey, who brought his carrier into Pearl Harbor in the dark night of December 8th, and after surveying the still smoldering damage, was reported to have growled, "When this war is over, the Japanese language will be spoken only in hell." Such hatred and lack of respect or compassion is not relegated to the history books, however. There is a real-time example of how we as a people need to improve going on in a suburban area near St. Louis, Missouri. I'm talking about Ferguson, the small town that has seen its share of pain and strife. It is a town struggling to put some sense of understanding about what transpired the day of August 9th, when Officer Darren Wilson confronted Michael Brown. My take on the event may be, no, it probably will be, at odds with a number of you regarding who is at fault, who stands accountable, and what needs to happen to prevent another Ferguson. So let me explain a little bit about myself. I am a man of decidedly conservative leanings. Though my marriage has softened my feelings on some subjects, same-sex marriage for one, I find that my stance on other topics is diametrically opposed to some in the official UUA stance. For example, I oppose most reasons for abortion and feel the practice is wrong. I support capital punishment. I am for the private, responsible ownership of firearms. And while I think war is an anathema to the human evolution, I realize the need to defend peace-supporting peoples everywhere, even by force, if necessary. Now bear in mind, I'm not going into depth with these topics. It's another time, another sermon. This topic today is perspective. When the altercation between Officer Wilson and Mr. Brown first made news, the people's knee-jerk reaction was, white racist cop guns down innocent black people. We heard from witnesses who maintained that Michael Brown had his hands above his head and surrendered. Information leaked that Mr. Brown had a bullet wound at the top of his skull. As Officer Wilson was brought in to explain his actions, Ferguson began to burn. Protests that the Brown family asked to be peaceful turned into riots. People flew in from as far away as Oakland, California to flip cars. The police in Ferguson were demonized for using military surplus vehicles and body armor to help protect themselves and contain the violence. The ugly scene was perpetuated just a few days ago when a grand jury, after carefully weighing all the evidence, according to the district attorney, agreed there was not enough sufficient evidence to bring Officer Wilson to trial for Michael Brown's shooting. It was to go down in the history books, not as a crime, but as a tragedy. Once again, Ferguson burned. The protest went farther this time. People in Providence, Rhode Island blocked I-95. In Oakland, protesters set dumpsters on fire and blocked intersections. There were plenty of peaceful actions, of course. But the reason I bring this second round of protests up is because in this incident, the protest, in my opinion, had no merit. The system worked. The 12 jurors, 7 men, 5 women, 9 white, 3 African American, had access to more evidence in this case than any grand jury had ever been given, and still came back with a no vote. The district attorney even went so far as to give some of the grand jury's reasons for voting this way. Witnesses recanted, some claimed they weren't even there, etc., etc. Still, people reacted, not because the system failed, which it didn't, but because they didn't get the answer that they wanted. Now, if it sounds like I am using the pulpit to defend Officer Wilson, I claim a small amount of culpability. My brother-in-law was a Milford cop, and he can attest that even in a mostly white city like Milford, Connecticut, people go out on duty, police go out on duty, with a sense of awareness, knowing that every traffic stop, every domestic violence call could be their last. And in a community like Ferguson, where the population is 65% African American, while the police are staffed 78% white, the sense can only be more palatable. The level of distrust on both sides, as it has been reported in the media, is an obstacle that no one seems able to surmount. It seems to be a question as old as time itself. How do we, as a society, put aside these feelings of fear and anger? How do we replace long-simmering hatred before it boils over, whether it be at a Hawaiian naval base or in the streets of a Missouri town? Why can't we, as the phrase goes, all just get along? Depending on who you speak to, you'll get different answers. Some people believe that the people in power are perpetuating these divisions to divert our attention from solving problems as one. Others point to upbringing, not just failing parents, but failing teachers, failing priests, and failing mentors. Some say society is to blame for refusing to give minorities a fair shake in life, whether it be comparable wages or the lopsided way the justice system works. All of these can be applied to what is currently shaking out in Ferguson, but no one can point to one cause and say, that's it. There is, unfortunately, no quick fix. There is one thing all are in agreement about. The tragedy of Ferguson must not be allowed to repeat itself. And the sooner we set our minds to it, the better off we all will be. The solution comes down to choices. We as a society must make choices on what type of world we choose to live in. Do we live in a world of fear and skepticism? Or do we live in a world of love and understanding? Notice I didn't say acceptance. I believe we must simply not forfeit our values to differing schools of thought, but we must strive to understand where they're coming from and work to seek common ground. I do not simply accept the belief that some have, that Officer Wilson was patrolling the streets of Ferguson with thoughts of killing young African-American men in his head. But perhaps by examining the apprehension that minorities in Ferguson have being served by a mostly Caucasian police force, perhaps we could touch upon a common goal, whether that be a sit-down between civic leaders and police brass, or perhaps encouraging African-American men to join the Ferguson Police Department. I would also like to say compromise must be a two-way street. If the establishment is willing to work to foster a sense of amity with the community has to be halfway. Open up a dialogue with the police. End the us versus them mentality, which permeates the air in some of these communities, making it harder for the police to do their jobs. It's time for everyone to adhere to the inherent worth and dignity principle that we, as Unitarian Universalists, promote. I just heard a few days ago, a young African-American man was found slain in his car in Ferguson. A young man whose family claims was a great kid. He was employed, a student, and not involved in any nefarious activities. His transgression? Though not confirmed, it is speculated that this young man testified before the grand jury that exonerated Officer Wilson. Apparently, this young man was slain for speaking the truth in the event. We need to stop this now. Even Michael Brown's family, who has more reason to be filled with hate than anyone, has asked for peace. Perhaps we should listen to them and honor Michael Brown's memory, not by trashing local bakeries, but by focusing our energy on stopping the next tragedy. As for finding out just what happened between Mr. Brown and Officer Wilson, we may never truly know. As my stepdaughter pointed out, as I was writing this sermon, there are only two people in this world who know what truly happened that day. One is dead, and the other is in fear of his life. We have a long road ahead of us. Detractors have always maintained that in some cases, integration is impossible, as the hatreds go back centuries. It seems we in the United States have always been witness to these divides. The great melting pot has seen some fissures during its history. The treatment of Native Americans, the Irish, the Chinese, Africans, and Japanese, just to name a few, have put stress cracks on our promised land. The pot, however, has stayed together due to our ability to fall back on our ability to see common ground and compromise. I would like to end this sermon with two examples of what we can do as a society when we channel our energy for the positive. The first is from 73 years ago. Mr. Hayase had lived on an island in Puget Sound since his father immigrated to this country from Japan many years earlier. He was a modest, successful farmer, able to support his wife, 2 daughters, son, and aging mother. He retained some of the old world's customs, but had worked hard to adopt the practices of his new homeland. He was on friendly terms with his neighbors and was regarded as an honest man who could be trusted. With the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, public suspicion of Japanese Americans began to grow into hysteria. In March of 1942, Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, head of the Western Defense Command, issued the first evacuation order, giving all persons of Japanese ancestry 1 week to leave Bainbridge Island. The next morning, Mr. Harrington, Mr. James, and Mr. McClellan knocked on Mr. Hayase's door. They wished to speak to Mr. Hayase in private. The 3 men were elders of the local Methodist church. They offered to buy Mr. Hayase's farm for $1. They promised to hold it for him and return it to him at the end of the war. Mr. Hayase consented. Within a few months, he and his family had been evacuated to one of the internment camps. Mr. Harrington's son moved into the abandoned farm to care for the property. When this war was over, news of Mr. Hayase's return spread through the small community. The elders moved young Harrington out of the home and presented Mr. Hayase with the deed to the property, which they sold to him for $1. The second example is a recent one from Ferguson. It is the story of Natalie's Cakes, a local bakery the bakery that I alluded to in the sermon, suffer the ravages of unrest that hit Ferguson. After Natalie, the bakery's owner, posted her tears online, concerned citizens from all over this country rallied to send her not just money, which, by the way, so far $200,000 has gone to repair her bakery, but they sent her business. She now has enough work to keep her busy through March. Compassion can happen. Common ground can be found. And hope can arise from the ashes of tragedy. Here ended the lesson.